On Christmas Eve of 2010, Blake Ruff walked into his Texas home to find something no husband ever wants to see. His wife, Lori Erica Ruff, had ended her own time on this earth. The couple had been separated for several weeks, and Lori had struggled with severe paranoia, depression, and was also being incredibly secretive. But even with the difficulties in their marriage, Blake never expected it to end this way. Lori had locked herself in the family car. She had left behind cryptic notes, and she made it clear that whatever she had been running from had finally caught up to her. But Lori's passing was just the beginning of this mystery. After the funeral, Blake's family decided to clean out her belongings. That's when they found a metal lockbox. It was hidden deep inside the house. Inside it, they discovered something that would make their blood run cold. A birth certificate. But it wasn't Lori's. There was a name change document and a fake social security number. Blake had known Lori for nearly a decade. He had married her, had a child with her. He had built an entire life with her. But the truth was, he had never really known her at all, because Lori Ruff wasn't who she claimed to be. From the moment that Blake Ruff met Lori Erica Kennedy, something about her did perhaps seem off. She was quiet, reserved, and intensely private. She had no family photos, no childhood friends, and she relayed no stories from her past. Whenever Blake asked her about her time before Texas, she just brushed it off and changed the subject. At first, he didn't think too much of it. Some people have complicated pasts, and Lori seemed like she just wanted to move forward. They got married in 2004, and for a while, things were fine. But over time, Lori became more paranoid, more possessive, more unstable. She was obsessed with her privacy. She shredded every document that had her name on it. She refused to meet Blake's parents, avoiding any family events or gatherings. And then came the notebooks. Pages and pages filled with scribbled writing, paranoia, and phrases that just didn't make sense. After the couple had their daughter together, Lori's behavior only got worse. She would now have mood swings, unexplained outbursts, and moments of sheer panic whenever something from her past was mentioned. Eventually, Blake just couldn't take it anymore. After years of tension, he left her, and just weeks later, on Christmas Eve, Lori did what she did. Now, back to the lockbox the family found when they were clearing out her things. She really didn't want it to be found. The birth certificate they found inside the box was for someone named Becky Sue Turner. The name change document showed that Becky Sue had legally changed her name to Lori Erica Kennedy. The fake social security number that she had was completely untraceable. At first, Blake's family thought they finally had some answers about Lori's past. Until that is, they looked up Becky Sue Turner. Instead, they discovered that she had perished in a house fire in 1971 at just 24 months. Lori had stolen her identity, which meant that her own real past was still a mystery. She had erased herself, created a new person, and lived in secrecy for decades. But why? Was she running from a bad home life, from a criminal past, or maybe a dangerous secret? The lockbox had revealed something, but it hadn't shown them who she really was. With the discovery of her stolen identity, Blake and his family realized that Lori had been hiding something, and it was much, much bigger than they ever imagined. They pinned their hopes on private investigators, hoping that they could uncover who she really was. But every trail led to dead ends. Lori really seemed to have no past whatsoever. There were no records of her birth, no family members coming forward, no trace of where she had come from before she assumed the identity of Becky Sue Turner. Frustrated and desperate for answers, Blake's family now contacted the FBI. But even the FBI, with all their resources, still couldn't figure out who Lori really was. Her fingerprints weren't in any national database. Her dental records didn't match any missing persons case. Her documents, phone records, and financial history all just led back to the fake identity that she had created for herself. It was as if Lori Kennedy had simply materialized out of nowhere in the late 1980s. The search for her real identity dragged on for years. Every lead that investigators pursued just came up empty time and time again. And just when it seemed like the truth would never be known, forensic genealogy changed everything. For 6 years, the mystery remained. Then in 2016, the case was finally cracked. A DNA sample from Laurie was uploaded to a genealogy database, and investigators incredibly found a match. Her real name was finally revealed. She was, in fact, Kimberly McLean. Kimberly had been born in Pennsylvania in 1968, and until she was 18 years old, she had lived a completely normal life. Then in 1986, something happened. Kimberly had a dispute with her family, and without warning, she disappeared. She never contacted them again. She never used her real name again, and she never looked back. Shortly after leaving home, she stole the identity of Becky Sue Turner, and then became Laurie Kennedy. For the next 2 decades, she built an entirely new life. But why? No one truly knows what happened between Kimberly and her family. What was so bad that it made her erase herself completely? Was she running from a terrible home life? A secret she couldn't reveal? Or a fear she didn't even dare speak of? Her family was shocked when investigators finally tracked them down. They just assumed that Kimberly had simply run away, but they never imagined that she had changed her identity completely. I don't know about you, but this case made me feel weird. Something bad must have happened. Something very, very bad. February the 15th, 1974. A cold grey morning in Dunn County, Wisconsin. On the side of a rural road, a driver noticed something strange in a ditch. At first, it looked like a pile of discarded clothing, but as they slowed down, reality sank in. It was, in fact, a woman's body, motionless, no longer alive. Her name was Mary Kathleen Schleus. She was a 25-year-old artist from Minneapolis, Minnesota. She met her end due to an attack with a sharp implement. She was then left in the snow like garbage. There were no witnesses to what happened, no clear suspect, and for nearly 50 years her case remained a mystery. Mary wasn't just another victim in a cold case file. She was an artist, a free spirit, and a woman with big dreams. At 25 years old, she was focused on her future. She planned to attend an art show in Chicago, and there she hoped to sell some of her work. Like many young people in the 1970s, Mary decided to hitchhike. It wasn't unusual at the time, but have no doubt it could be dangerous. She left Minneapolis with only her art supplies, planning to just catch rides along the way and see what happened. But she never made it to Chicago. Instead, she ended up in that ditch, miles from home, and the man who put her there would walk free for nearly 5 decades. On that February morning, the quiet roads in Dunn County were coated in a thin layer of frost. Police quickly arrived at a gruesome scene. They could tell by looking this was no accident, nor was it self-inflicted. Mary had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, suggesting she had bravely fought for her life. They believed the killer had left nothing behind except a body. But who had done this, and why? The lack of evidence made solving this case nearly impossible in 1974. Although Mary had been found just hours after her passing, this meant the killer still had a big head start. He could be on his way to anywhere by now. In the time it took police to identify Mary, the trail had already hit a dead end. Nobody had seen her get into a car, nobody knew who she was last with, and whoever killed her appeared to have escaped without a trace. The case was cold. Investigators, though, never stopped searching, and the family never stopped hoping. But new leads weren't coming in, and the technology just wasn't there yet. Then in 2009, Mary's body was exhumed. Detectives hoped that modern DNA testing could finally bring some answers. But without a suspect, this whole process proved unfruitful and the case stalled once again. Finally, in 2024, everything now changed. Investigators revisited the original crime scene evidence, and they focused on something overlooked for years. There was a hat found near Mary's body. It had been collected as evidence, but at the time, there was no way to extract DNA from hair without the roots being present. But with advances in technology, all that changed. Scientists were now able to extract a full DNA profile from hairs found on the cap. When they ran the results through a genealogy database, a match appeared. His name was John Keith Miller, an 84-year-old man from Owatonna, Minnesota. Previously, he had never been a suspect, but now police had this undeniable evidence that he was there with Mary on her final day. Although it wasn't proof he'd done this, at least finally it was something. But then when they confronted him, he finally just told the truth. For nearly 50 years, John Keith Miller lived a quiet life. He was now a retired Minnesota resident, seemingly harmless, but his past told a different story. Miller had a criminal history, including a 1978 SA case that should have put him on the police radar decades ago, but for whatever reason, it didn't. With his DNA not in the system until now, his name was never linked to Mary's murder. He had walked free all these years, while Mary's case sat unsolved, and her family were left without answers. Now at 84 years old, his past had finally caught up to him. The evidence now felt overwhelming, and when detectives sat him down, he didn't deny it. Instead, he gave a full confession. In November of 2024, Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Now, he himself probably had only a few years left that didn't matter to authorities. He had lived freely for decades, whilst Mary's family struggled on. Miller admitted to picking Mary up while she was hitchhiking. When she resisted his unwanted advances, he snapped. He used a sharp implement on her multiple times and then left her out in the cold. We can imagine he thought he'd escaped justice, but now finally he would face the consequences. The only real question left is, with Miller seemingly doing this with such ease, does he have any more victims out there? Investigators do believe he may be linked to other unsolved murders in the Midwest. The 1970s in many ways were a dangerous time, especially for hitchhikers. Young women were disappearing at alarming rates, and their bodies were turning up in remote locations. And many of those cases are still unsolved. Will John Miller ever be linked to any more of these cases? And unless he lives to be the oldest person in known history, John will never see freedom again. Two hikers trudged through the bitter Pennsylvania winter. They were following a winding trail near the Pinnacle, a rocky overlook on the Appalachian Trail. The cold was biting and they needed shelter, and that's when they saw it, a cave hidden beneath a frozen landscape. They stepped inside hoping to escape the wind, but instead they found something else. A man's body frozen in place. He was tucked deep within the cave's shadows. He had no ID, no name, just a mystery sealed in ice. The hikers stood frozen, not from the cold, but from what lay before them. A man curled up in the depths of the cave. His skin was pale. His body was still. At first they thought he may have simply fallen asleep. But, of course, the truth was far worse. They rushed to report their discovery, and soon Pennsylvania State Police arrived on the scene. The man had no wallet, no identification, nothing to say who he was. But there were some identifying factors. The man was white. He was between 25 and 35 years old, and he had reddish-brown hair and blue eyes. He wore a brown suede jacket with tassels. He had on blue jeans and a turtleneck sweater. However, nobody knew who he was. An autopsy revealed what had really happened. The man hadn't passed away from exposure. Instead, he had overdosed. Toxicology tests found phenobarbital and pentobarbital in his system. These are sedatives commonly used for epilepsy or insomnia. The dose he took was lethal, something they didn't believe was an accident. His end was ruled to have come by his own hands. But without a name, the case stalled almost immediately. There was no missing persons reports that matched. No family members came forwards. So now they just had an unidentified man, buried beneath a number. Just one more John Doe. He would become known as the Pinnacle John Doe, or just the Pinnacle Man, and his story would remain a mystery until, that is, 47 years later, when the truth would finally surface. For decades, the Pinnacle Man was just a ghost, a nameless body buried in an unmarked grave. The case was filed away and gathering dust. Every few years, investigators would revisit the files, hoping for a new lead, but nothing ever came. Then in 2019, forensic teams exhumed his body for DNA analysis. This was supposed to be the moment for a big breakthrough, but there were no matches, no close relatives in any database. The reconstruction of his face didn't seem to be too effective. His remains were too far gone for the image to be useful. And so the mystery only deepened. For 5 more years, the Pinnacle Man remained unknown. And then in 2024, everything would change. A Pennsylvania State Police detective made a simple discovery, one that had been overlooked for decades. The original fingerprint cards from the 1977 autopsy still existed, and nobody had ever run them through modern systems. So that is exactly what he did. The prints were sent to NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Person Systems, and after all these years, within just 1 hour, the FBI had a match. The Pinnacle Man was Nicholas Paul Grubb. He was 27 years old when he met his end. He had a family, a past, a story, one that had been waiting for nearly half a century to be told. The question now was, how and why did he get there? Born in 1950, Nicholas spent his early years in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania. He was a quiet, thoughtful young man. He was known for his intelligence and reserved nature. In the early 1970s, he served in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard. Later, he moved to Colorado, where he lived for several years, before eventually returning to Pennsylvania. But somewhere along the way, something changed. He would become estranged from his family, and in January of 1977, he walked into a cave and never walked out. And the truth about his life was stranger than anyone expected. Nicholas's past was complicated. His grandfather, Norman Grubb, a British missionary and well-known religious writer, but his father, that's where things took a turn. Nicholas's dad, Paul Grubb, was London's so-called call girl king. He was infamous for running a high-end escort service in the 1950s. The scandal was massive, making headlines across the UK. It shattered the family's reputation. Nicholas's parents separated, and he was sent to live in the US with his grandparents. Over time, he became distant. He lost touch with relatives, drifting further away. By 1977, he had vanished completely, and there he would lay in that cave, and then in an unmarked grave. Coming from such a family, we can imagine the rumour mill was in high gear. Maybe it just got all too much. Maybe he was involved in a world he shouldn't have been, and he could have found himself out of his depth. Sadly, this seems like one mystery that the Pinnacle Man took with him, never to be solved. It started with a discovery that no one expected. In July 1994, 2 hitchhikers were making their way through the remote wilderness of Montrose County, Colorado, a rugged landscape of canyons and thick forests. They were following a trail near Divide Road, a stretch of land locals called Windy Point, and it was there that something caught their attention. At first, it seemed like nothing, probably just an animal. Just a scattering of bones half buried in the dirt, bleached by the sun. But as they stepped closer, the truth became horrifyingly clear. This was a human skull. It lay along with fragments of a jawbone, ribs and vertebrae. Nearby, partially covered by soil, lay a gold-crowned molar, a haunting sign that this person had once been very much alive, had once spoken, eaten, laughed, before then vanishing into silence. Authorities were called to the scene, but identifying the remains would not be easy. There were no personal belongings, no clothing, no clear signs of what had happened. The elements had stripped the remains of nearly all identifying features, leaving nothing but bones and many, many questions. The forensic team estimated that the victim was a woman, likely between 35 and 40 years old, and that she had reddish-brown hair. But really, that was all they knew. With no clear leads, she became known as the Windy Point Jane Doe, lost in a system full of unidentified remains. And for nearly 3 decades, that's all she would be. Until, that is, a breakthrough revealed a disturbing connection that no one saw coming. A year before the discovery in Colorado, 1,200 miles away in Washington state, a woman named Susan Elizabeth Hobbs was living an ordinary and quiet life. Susan had recently moved from California to Pierce County, Washington, and she was just looking for a fresh start. She kept in regular contact with her family. She'd send letters. She made plans with them, and she would talk excitedly about the future. She wasn't the type of person to just disappear, but in the summer of 1993, something changed. The letters stopped. The phone stopped ringing. And Susan, who had been so present in her family's life, simply vanished. At first, no one was too alarmed. Maybe she had moved again, started over somewhere new. But as weeks turned into months, unease really started to set in. And then her landlord made a discovery that turned concern into fear. Susan's mobile home was abandoned, and everything inside was left untouched. Her clothing, her furniture, her personal belongings. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious explanation. It was as if she had simply walked out one day and never returned. Her family reported her missing on August 9, 1993, but with no witnesses, no activity on her bank accounts, and no trace of where she had gone, the case just went cold. So for years, she was just another missing person, one more name in a system full of open cases. For nearly 3 decades, the cases of Windy Point Jane Doe and Susan Hobbs remained entirely separate mysteries. One, a nameless skeleton found in the wilderness. The other, a missing woman who had seemingly vanished into thin air. And remember, these two things were 1,200 miles apart. One thing that authorities could do to try and bring a name to the Windy Point Jane Doe was to recreate her face using science and a little bit of guesswork. The idea of these images is to try and jog the memory of those that have known or maybe just seen her, and that is where this haunting image comes from. Investigators in Montrose County, Colorado, worked tirelessly to uncover who their Jane Doe was, but they just weren't having much luck. The gold-crowned molar found with her remains did suggest that she had received dental work that wasn't really very common. It could potentially be a sign of wealth or of access to specialized care. A gold crown isn't something that you need. It's a high-end choice where cheaper options are available. And it also helped to put a date on how long Jane Doe had been there. They estimated that she'd been there since 1993, possibly earlier, but there were no missing persons reports that matched her description. And with no DNA match in the national databases, Windy Point Jane Doe's case faded into the background. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Susan's disappearance remained unsolved. Her mobile home sat abandoned, a ghostly reminder of the life that she left behind, seemingly in an instant. Friends and family held on to hope, wondering if she had chosen to start over, and hoping that one day she might return out of nowhere with a story to tell. Sadly, by the early 2000s, both cases had gone completely cold. But then, in 2020, technology offered something investigators in 1994 never had: forensic genealogy. We're talking DNA. A sample of Windy Point Jane Doe's remains was submitted to a national database. It was searched for potential relatives, a family tree, and anyone connected to her by blood. For 28 years, she had been an unknown stranger. But then, in April of 2022, the DNA results came back. Windy Point Jane Doe wasn't nameless anymore. She was Susan Elizabeth Hobbs. The revelation was shocking. For nearly 3 decades, Susan Hobbs had been classified as a missing person in Washington. But meanwhile, her remains had been lying in the wilderness of Colorado. This discovery raised far more questions than answers. How did she end up there? Who brought her over 1,200 miles from home, and why? Investigators determined that Susan had likely been ended in 1993, shortly after her abandoned mobile home was discovered. but they still had no official cause of death. Her remains had been exposed to the elements for so long that any evidence of what had happened to her was left impossible to confirm. There were no bullet wounds on the bones. There was no obvious signs of blunt force trauma, nor of a sharp implement being used. But detectives didn't believe for a second that she had gotten there on her own. Someone must have taken her from Washington, whether they did it by force or manipulation, and then they attacked her and left her in the remote forests of Montrose County, Colorado. Was it someone she trusted? Maybe someone she met shortly before she disappeared? Or maybe she'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, simply picked up by a stranger who never intended to let her go. What little was left of her told no story, but the police deduced one thing. Susan would not have left Washington voluntarily. Her family knew her, and they knew she wouldn't do that. It just wasn't their Susan. The mystery of who the Windy Point Jane Doe was solved, but even with Susan's identity confirmed, there was still a mystery that to this day would be left unsolved. Who was responsible? We may never know, but at least Susan can now be laid to rest.